Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Wingapo Naptewak. My name is Trini. I'm Matspanaim Pamunki. Welcome to the MMIWG2ST NYC Plus East Coast Summit, showcasing indigenizing AI. This summit is a month-long gathering beginning on the National Day of Remembrance for MMIR on May 5th. Together, we bring together the groundbreaking work of activists beyond colonial borders to honor our collective resistance and survival against systems that profit from our silence and erasure. Today, we're excited to announce the launch of UIC's AI-powered MMIP policy tracker to better serve community and more quickly track the latest MMIP legislation. We've leveraged ChatGPT-4 to create an MMIP-focused AI-powered policy analysis tool where UIC staff can enter a curated list of MMIP policy links from Legiscan and receive an Excel file with each policy analysis, including checking for gender-inclusive language, pros and cons, Indigenous scholarships, and more. Each entry in the Excel file is reviewed by a UIC staff member for consistency and accuracy before uploading the policy analysis to our database. Once the policy has been added to our database, it appears on an interactive policy map live on urbanindigenouscollective.org. At today's session, we'll discuss how UIC is applying AI in a balanced manner to push back against the data genocide faced by Indigenous communities. With that being said, it brings me no greater honor to introduce my Southeastern Woodland relative, Austin Serio, IT manager of the Urban Indigenous Collective, co-founder of Shock Talk. Austin is a member of the Chicori and Shakari tribe of South Carolina. Austin is a descendant from Indigenous and white sharecroppers on his mother's side, and New York City's Italian-American settlers on his father's side. As a part of the Great Migration of the 60s, Austin's ancestors walked away from sharecropping alongside other peoples of color by migrating to the Southeast for the good union jobs. Growing up as a two-spirit urban native in the Simsbury area of Hartford, Austin has found himself at powerful intersections between the forces of technology and globalization. During and after pursuing his degree in technology and globalization at NYU Gallatin, Austin continued to enhance his product design skills as a Chicori Shakari tribal web developer and the lead product designer at Up2Code, Z Aerospace, and Blue World Inc. While pursuing his degree at Gallatin, Austin worked for Apple at one of their HQ locations and observed the structural changes presenting rolling the global economy firsthand. Finding himself at another powerful global crossroads, Austin is currently focused on the intersections between Indigenous communities, sustainability, and product design. And with that, Kana, Austin, I deeply, deeply admire your infinite creative and intellectual thinking space. Thank you so much for developing this work and gathering with, us here today.
For that lovely introduction, relative. And Jipiwo, Biwa. Hello, relatives. So happy to be here with you all today. Thank you all for just taking taking some time out of, your really busy schedule to join us. We've got some things that we've been working on and, some ideas we've been kicking around that we're super excited to share with you. And so, yeah, I'll just go ahead and start getting into things. So if y'all just give me 1 second here, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get rocking and rolling. All right, can everyone see the slides all right?
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yep, I can
Yes.
see them.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. So yeah, so again, Agoa for joining me today. And so, just want to take this time to, talk about, AI, from an Indigenous perspective, some opportunities, some pitfalls that, kind of lie on the horizon. But just to get us started, I wanted to just kind of open this conversation by foregrounding exactly like what really is AI? What do we mean by that? Because it could actually refer to a bunch of different things, and it's really a huge broad concept. So wanted to just start out by just taking in a little bit of background together. Um, So yeah, so when we're talking about what do we mean by AI, like what is exactly meant by AI, and so it's just very broadly defined as a non-human programmer model that can, perform sophisticated tasks such as, image recognition or image generation, speech recognition, language processing, or other types of predictive, behavior. So really, really broad, could really encompass a whole different, a whole bunch of different types of technologies. Um, so there's really a lot of different, applications that can sort of meet, or match this definition. But what I think, you know, has grabbed a lot of folks' attention and what we're, really here to talk about today is a specific type of AI called large language models or LLM. And so these large language models are actually just a subset of a different type of AI that's actually become very common and popular over at least the past decade. So a lot of us are actually already pretty familiar with machine learning in our everyday life. So, what that kind of looks like is like when you're on Spotify and it, suggests a new song based off of, your past listening behavior. That's an example of machine learning. Another example would be, auto-generated playlists in Spotify, or also some of the functionality that we have in turn-by-turn GPS is also based off of machine learning. So, there's really a broad application of, what we consider to be AI already, pretty deeply woven into the fabric of both the web and just, the digital technology that we use on a day-to-day basis. Um, so yeah, so machine learning's been common for a while, but it's really this specific type of machine learning called large language models that have really, again, kind of lit up the night sky as if it were. That's really kind of grabbing people's attention. So large language models are actually just an offshoot of something that are just called regular language models. And again, what that is that's just like the predictive text that you see on your phone, the autocomplete. Um, that's an example of just a regular language model. And so large language models actually came about, as we know, pretty recently, due to an invention, an innovation that came about by Google, because Google has really been long term, has been really leading the development of AI. And so, without getting too crazy into the weeds of it, really, this innovation that Google came up with that are called transformers allows the computer to parse the text in a non-sequential manner and decide which parts of the text are actually, the most important and most relevant by, providing weight to specific types of words. Um, so that innovation allowed for the really to really open the door for there to be leaps and bounds in how computers process natural language and reason from them. So, and again, these are some of the things that we are, hearing a lot more about, whether it's ChatGPT or Google Gemini. Um, that is, just sort of, again, at a high level, what a large language model is, and how a little bit about how it works, and also just, examples that y'all have probably seen in the everyday. And so, since we've taken a second here just to, again, really, talk about, okay, what do we really mean by AI? What's an LLM? I want to talk a little bit more now about, again, the specifics of how it works and why they're helpful. And the reason why I want to talk about how it works is not to put you all asleep, but to really get clear on what this is useful for, what it's not useful for, and what some of its drawbacks are. Um, so with that, LLMs, like these large language models, um, are based off of an extensive training process that allows for this thing called zero-shot learning, which in other words, basically is a process where, when folks are building, these models like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, I think as a lot of us know, these models get trained on, the data that's out there, huge sets of data that, found by crawling through Google. So, it's that deep training that then enables what I just referred to as zero-shot learning, where instead of having to, tell this model how to do every little thing, it's already got such a breadth of knowledge, such a breadth of training that with very little additional info, it can pick up on what you're saying from a prompt and provide you with at least a somewhat accurate and relevant answer. Um, so that's really the core of what these, really innovative AI models are doing. It's that, there's this really extensive training process that goes on that allows for, zero-shot learning, for folks to just go ahead, ask a question, and to be able to get an answer back without having to feed a ton of information into this to begin with. And so that comes with pros and cons. Again, doing extensive training on pre-existing data. We'll get into some of the pros and cons of that in a little bit, but definitely a really important part to remember of how these things are working. That again, it's being trained on pre-existing data, and that's being determined by whoever's sitting behind the keyboard making these decisions. So something to think about for later. But going back to again, how is a large language model really useful? Like, how does it actually do anything for anyone? It's really useful for natural language processing. So what do I mean by that? A lot, just to throw out an example of like how our brains work and process language. Oftentimes, like when you're in school, you're told like, hey, read whatever this piece of information is before class and come to class, ready to discuss it or come with questions. And that's because with the goal of having someone read that before class, that was to process the language. So that way you could then go ahead and do some analysis, make some decisions, have a broader conversation. But you needed to do that natural language processing first. So you actually knew what you were talking about, so you could take in that information and process it. And that's what LLMs, these large language models, that's what they're really good for. So they're really good at generating new text. They're really good at summarizing, text based off of something you've, put into them based off your input. And it's also really good at classifying, whatever data you put in there, classifying it into, several sets of categories, whether it's categories that you provide or you ask it to decide. Nonetheless, very useful for organizing and classifying data. And so the way that, again, this is actually useful and like actually provides like any value to anyone using this is that it really can help do the heavy lifting of, synthesizing, writing, of, again, if you're hung up on, a piece of the text and you're trying to figure out what it means, it can further explain it to you if you, and you might not have anyone else around that you can ask questions to. Again, also if you get a huge document, if you want to just have a summary quickly made for you without having to read the whole thing, it's great for that. And so these three use cases of text generation, summarization, and classification, when put together, are actually really, really powerful tools. And again, we'll get to how and what that looks like in a little bit. But again, really just what I want folks to take away from this is understanding that large language models are really good for processing natural language. And again, doing that to whether it's generate new text, summarize text, or classify, the data that you are feeding into it. those are really the three core natural language processing that LLMs are really solid for. And so with that, then now that we've taken about 10 minutes here to really ground ourselves in like, okay, what even is AI? What are we talking about here? I want to start exploring now these some questions that folks have had, particularly from an indigenous perspective of both AI and LLMs. Um, and so oftentimes, something I hear folks, sort of ascribe to AI are, these human-like characteristics. And it's kind of hard not to, right? When you have something that you can have a conversation with and interact with. Um, it's kind of hard to not say, hey, this is a behavior that I only see other human people doing. Therefore, you must be a human people. Um, but the thing is that just because there is natural language there does not necessarily mean that this is a living, breathing person or organism. And so the reason I mention that is because there are some very real concerns about the impact of AI and things like, oh, AI is going to take over the world, and oh, this is going to end in Skynet, and all those kinds of things. Those possibilities are, again, if used incorrectly, you could have some of those far-fetched possibilities you know come true, but that's not because of AI itself. And again, we'll talk about what I mean by that and how that works. But the core of it really being is that AI is not conscious. And specifically, if we want to talk about that from an indigenous perspective, what I really think of are the intersection of, how we know spirits live in non-human people, and also the importance of water. And so I think something that many folks who, are active in indigenous community will be familiar with is the concept that water is life. And there is no water or soul when it comes to AI, so to speak. So just because something might be, maybe there's a turbine that's turned by water, but that is not the same as actually containing the essence of water and the essence of life. So, for example, what I think of is, just to use an example of like the tree spirit. So um, I'm a member of the Chikoran Chakri tribe. We are Siouan speakers. We speak Tutelo Saponi, so our word for spirit would be Mampa. We also live with Algonquin speakers, and so there's different forms of this word, but another word that's often used to refer to spirits is Manitou. And so AI has no Mampa or no Manitou, and that's because it is not composed of water. It is not fundamentally a part of life. It is an extension of us. It's a tool that we've made. And that's what I really want to share with folks is that AI is not, a human in a box. It's a tool. It's a tool that kind of looks and feels like a human in a box, but it's not. Um, and again, we'll talk about a little bit more about why that is, but specifically it has to do with the fact that this has no spirit, it has no water, therefore it is not necessarily a piece of life, even though it may mimic or represent it in certain ways. And so again, with that, the fact that AI is really a tool, that means that as any other tool, the existence of the tool in and of itself is fairly neutral. It's about how it's used. So any tool that has a large impact when you use it, that impact could be either good or bad, again, depending on how it's used. And that outcome of whether it's being used in a good way or a bad way is really dependent on this process called social reproduction. And that's what we're going to talk about very quickly next. But it's very important because this is a principle that really follows us through all of the systems that we interface with. And it explains often why sometimes when folks say, hey, I'm going to break off and do something else, why it ends up replicating the same problems as the dominant system. So social reproduction describes simply the process of reproducing the existing social structures and systems. So in other words, it's about the maintenance and continuity of existing social relations. So what does that mean? That means essentially, oftentimes folks end up replicating the existing system because the relationships and way that these tools are being used aren't fundamentally different. The structures that are organized behind the way that these tools are implemented are not fundamentally different, which is why we end up replicating the same problems over and over again. So then to take this, to a more tangible example, again, about, some of the very real concerns that folks have expressed about the dangers of AI, and the impact it could have. I think that's where we have to really talk about how AI is being applied. So for example, then, if we're using AI to continue to accelerate and amplify the existing system of social relations, that's settler colonialism and capitalism, it's going to continue to increase, inequality and climate change. And so to the point where some folks might be familiar with a term used by Winona LaDuke called Wendigo economics, or as I might use the Powhatan version of that word, Wintico economics, which again is just a reference to this settler system of social relations and also global capitalism that is really intent on devouring the land and everything on it. And so if we're using something to hyper accelerate that, if we're just using a tool to further the current systems that are structured that way, it will have a detrimental outcome, as we know, because we know the current systems have highly detrimental outcomes. So it's about using these tools not to continue to reproduce the current system, but to try to build a new dynamic. So again, just to kind of bring up a visual here, this is what I would argue sort of what the current system looks like. And again, right now, a lot of folks are using AI to accelerate and amplify this structure of relationship, which is absolutely where some of the concerns, for pitfalls come in. So that's one thing that, again, I want folks to also really know. And this is also, again, earlier when we were talking about training AI, that's where that is also really important. And it's important for us to also be there and to get our knowledge in and centered when these models are being trained. So for example, oftentimes these models are being trained with direction and input from broadly English-speaking white male people. And that is going to skew the way that AI approaches and processes data and necessarily thinks what's relevant, what's important, what's not important. Because the reality is that, there are things that I know, things that are documented that I can prove that AI has no idea about because it wasn't trained on them, because whoever was training those models wasn't aware of that knowledge. So it got left out. And so that's where, again, you have the conditions for social reproduction, where then if folks just really start relying on AI and all AI knows is what, the dominant system told it to look at, then it's going to be missing a lot of the picture. So really what I'm trying to highlight here is that AI is only as good as the data you put into it. So if you put bad data into it, if you put data that's supporting bad relationships into it, then you're going to get bad data out and you're going to get bad outcomes. So in this whole debate that I think folks have had about, like, is AI good? Is AI bad? AI is absolutely fundamentally point blank terrible. And again, it really comes down to how the tool is used, who's feeding knowledge into it, and what the goal is of that knowledge and that output. And so it's really up to us then to say, we want to build a different dynamic and this is how we're going to do it. And so that's what I want to talk about next. So as we've talked about, LLMs really have a huge potential for impact associated with them, both positive and negative. And so, we've talked a little bit about how LLMs work, and we've talked a little bit about how, there's some dangers with them, really accelerating and reproducing the existing systems. But on the flip side of that, there's also a huge opportunity to use it to accelerate the creation of something new, something better, and something different, something that's built for us, something that has us in mind and actually serves our needs. Um, and so what I really mean by that is because LLMs are really good at natural language processing, that means that they provide us with the potential to really push back against the data genocide that indigenous communities have been, have been pushing back against for at least 500 years now. And so, a specific use case for how, AI could be really helpful is in the creation of disaggregated data. Um, and so, for folks who aren't as familiar, um, disaggregated data is really important. That's where we can, actually see the specific breakdown for Native folks of what, outcomes look like, outcomes, other important statistics. Um, you know, and it's really to the point where the UN Permanent Forum, considers it to be a topic of absolute primary importance. Um, and so, with that, it's really having that data is so important again for not only being able to better understand some of the obstacles and outcomes that are going on, but to also, increase the visibility that the impacts of settler colonialism and white supremacy culture are having on Native communities. But also, you can know how to build these solutions, but oftentimes when you go to funders, they'll ask you for data. Oftentimes, data that doesn't exist, and so AI could provide the opportunity to start producing some of that data that's missing that doesn't exist, and to be able to do that in an efficient way where it doesn't have to be a team of 10 people. It could maybe be half that. So really important for pushing back against the data genocide that our communities have faced. And again, both in the context of disaggregated data, but also in restoring and compiling our own histories as well, which is something that I'll touch on in a little bit further down the line. But the other part too that I want to talk about again is using LLMs for decolonization. Is that allows us, as I started talking about with some of the other examples, that allows us to analyze data from an indigenous perspective and using an indigenous framework, and it does that by allowing us to ask those questions, which I realize sounds perhaps a bit silly, but if you can pose a question from an indigenous perspective and then ask that question systemically every time that you are processing the data, you're getting a whole new data point based on a completely different perspective that the other folks who've been creating this data to this point are not bringing to the table. So that's where LLMs really have the potential to help amplify the cultural knowledge and perspective that indigenous folks have by assisting folks in processing the data and creating new data sets. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means actually right now. And so I want to share this really exciting work that we've been doing here at UIC, which has been the creation of our AI-powered policy tracker. And so that came about when our team was doing some work on the policy tracker that we started several years ago. And we've been doing our best as we can to keep it up to date. But as we were going through it and reorganizing some of the data, and then realizing some other data points that needed to be tracked, we sort of started to realize that each policy that we're tracking has like 26 different data points to it, and it was getting very overwhelming. And so at that point, it really sort of required that we needed to think of a new way of approaching this, because it was starting to take a lot of time in order to do what we needed to do and to do it well. And so that's when we started experimenting with AI and sort of seeing what we were doing. We were initially just doing it manually using ChatGPT through the browser. Recognize this opportunity to make the work we were doing be far more systematic and efficient. And that's where this idea for an AI-powered policy tracker was born. And so what I want to do now is I want to show you all just a quick demo of how it works. So let's just go ahead and take a peek at that together. All right. So I have I have pulled up right here. Can everyone see the browser window all right?
Yep. Yes.
Awesome. So I have right here, this is just a very simple, interface for a policy tracker. And I have just an example link here that I've saved just for our purposes. So this is actually the policy that was recently passed in New York State. It was a policy that UIC had a role in shaping. So I want to just go ahead and use this as our example. So I just went ahead and I hit submit. So you're going to see it's processing. And so what it's doing right now is it's pulling in all the details of the bill from this website called Legiscan. So it's getting in, the status, the sponsors, things of that nature. It's bringing all those pieces in. And then using that information from Legiscan, we also get the bill text from Legiscan, and we run that through ChatGPT, asking a series of questions about, that UIC has been focused on relative to the MMIP crisis. So as you can see, I put the link in there. It sent it out for analysis, and then what it's done is it's gone ahead and given me a Excel sheet to review with the policy analysis. I'm going to go ahead and open that here. Just bring this over to my window. Over here. All right. So just to kind of walk folks through here, here you can see just some of the basic information about the bill that we've pulled in. And any sort of, analysis based off of each of the categories. So for example, evaluating whether or not, there's a gender inclusive explanation, evaluating whether or not there are mechanisms for evaluation, evaluating, the pros and cons of the legislation, are really some of the core pieces of what we're looking at. But just to also circle back to the part when I was talking about analyzing data through an Indigenous perspective, it's really asking these specific questions, right? Like, are there prevention efforts? What do the prevention efforts look like? What is the level of survivor and relative input, right? These are questions that aren't being asked by folks over at Legiscan, right? Because if they were, I could just beam them in already through an API. These are questions that are unique to an Indigenous perspective. And that's what UIC is bringing when we're analyzing the data. And so what we've done then is we first created this process for how are we going to analyze this data, and we turned it into a set of questions, right? And so those are the questions that get asked every single time ChatGPT runs through a policy. So that's kind of how this works. I want to actually also go ahead and then show you all the next steps. So then what we do here is this is also a really important step here when we're reviewing the Excel file. And this is really part and parcel to how UIC is applying AI in a balanced manner. And what I mean by that is, so when we get this output, this has to be reviewed by a UIC team member. This isn't just AI, take the wheel, let's go, you do the work for me, I'm gonna sit back, have something to drink, or, relax and just be, whatever. This is very much so still something that requires folks to have an understanding of the bill that's being analyzed, so that way folks can go back and review for accuracy. Because AI makes mistakes. It makes plenty of mistakes. I catch them on the regular. And in that way, it is almost human-like, and that it makes mistakes. So it's not something to necessarily just be blindly trusted. It's a tool to help us focus on the more important pieces of the work that we need to do. So instead of spending time just grabbing all these specific, details, and then, okay, now I have to read the bill all the way through, analyze, and synthesize, it now takes it to where you do need to read the bill, so that way you know what's in it and you can review this for accuracy rather than having to synthesize a whole analysis and figure out how I'm going to, put that down into words. So that's how UIC is applying AI in a balanced manner. We're tapping into AI to allow it to do the really heavy work of processing that text and processing that language, but we're still coming in to check for accuracy and using our own, perspective, again, our own lived perspective as Indigenous people, to just see, does this make sense? And, is this culturally appropriate? Is this analysis culturally appropriate? Because again, AI makes mistakes, and its learning and its worldview are probably shaped by white English-speaking men. So that's something that has to be accounted for, especially, again, because to my knowledge, there's no foundational model like ChatGPT that's trained on, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous data set. So that's really what, the process looks like in terms of UIC applying AI in a balanced manner. But then also just to kind of show you all the rest of the flow of how this works. So once I get the Excel file and it's been reviewed, then the next step is to go ahead and upload it to UIC's policy tracker database. So we're going to go ahead and just take a peek at what that looks like together. So in the policy, so once you have, again, you've reviewed the Excel file, say it looks good, you can then just go ahead and we have this is a backend for us. We just go ahead, say that we want to import a Microsoft Excel file, drop it in, upload, and then we just tick this little box here, so that way it clears out the first row, which is just the labels from the spreadsheet. And then one click, we can go ahead and import it. I'm not going to do that because this policy is already in the database, so I don't want to make any duplicate. But then our policy tracker map right here refreshes once a day around midnight. So then after I upload the policy in there, I could either have it do a manual refresh, or it would automatically update itself overnight, and the results pop up over here on our policy tracker map, which is live, and you can get to it by going to urbanindigenouscollective.com under MMIWG2ST NYC plus, learn more about MMIWG2S. So that's where our policy tracker lives. And then you also get access as well to that Airtable list that I was just showing you all as well. So it's a little bit more comprehensive than the policy map itself, because it just has some additional data points to it that we haven't yet incorporated into the policy tracker map. That's something that is on our radar. But it does give you just a really nice way to flip through and see state by state what's going on, and to just dive into, again, some of those pieces of analysis that we were talking about before. And just to show an example, like if you really wanted to zoom in on, what was going on here, actually, why don't we pull up that bill in New York State we've been talking about together right here. So this was the bill that was just recently passed. I'd like to take a closer look at it. So I can just go ahead and hit that little expand button right here. And I can see the whole UIC shakedown on the bill and the analysis. And so that's just a quick look at, how we're applying AI in a balanced manner here at UIC. So I'm just going to go ahead and transition back now to our slides. All right. And so We also do have a really exciting vision for where we'd like to bring this policy tracker and some of the features that we'd really like to see next. So right now, it currently exists as the desktop app, but we are working on expanding, just making it a little easier for folks on the team to access if they want to do their own policy analyses. And then the other thing, some of the other features that we've got on the horizon as well is we want to switch from, currently we're using ChatGPT, but we'd like to switch to Google Gemini because it'll really increase the accuracy of the policy analyses that we're doing. And also it's just a lot more efficient and cost effective on the back end. Another function that we'd really like to see, in the future for the policy tracker is a data normalizer where it goes in and just fills in any gaps in the data as we've been, really expanding, some of the categories that we've been tracking and how we've been thinking about this. So just going in, having a function to go in and backfill some of those spots, as well as also creating a automated updating process for the policies that are already tracked in the database. So we have some policies that are, set as pending. So having those update regularly. And then also building a search function that crawls Legistan for, MMIP bills from the latest session. And then our team can, review whether or not we feel that bill is appropriate to be added to the policy tracker. And then have a button that you just go ahead and that gets, once that's approved, that gets sent out to the policy tracker for analysis. So those are just a few features that we've envisioned on the roadmap for a policy tracker as we continue to grow and expand its functionality. And then more broadly, again, as we've already talked about a little bit, these large language models can also be used, for decolonization. Again, both in, some of the more specific examples that we've talked about in terms of, creating disaggregated data sets. That way we can really see what's going on in community, or whether it's, building more data around the MMIP crisis, which can take a lot of different forms. But some of the other ways that AI can be applied for decolonization and really to the benefit of tribal nations would be in probably two main facets that I see, at least, which is one, just supporting the revitalization of indigenous cultures and histories. So what do I mean by that? If there are so I've worked, extensively on my tribe's, historical revitalization. And so, trying to build a timeline of that can be really confusing, and there's a bunch of different sources. So being able to bring all those sources together and, telling AI, hey, here are the specific things in the text that I need you to pay attention to that other people who are analyzing might not pay attention to. Having that come in, having that do, the summary and analysis, so that way, it's a lot easier for folks to recompile and share some of these histories that have been very intentionally buried, lost, destroyed. So many different ways to frame it, same outcome. So AI can be really, really powerful for, cultural and historical revitalization. And again, I sort of have seen that, firsthand with some of the work that I've done with my nation. But really, the other way that I see it being utilized is I also see great potential for the usage of these large language models and language revitalization. And so that's something that I also would really like to demo for you all as well. So I'm just going to go ahead here and very briefly show you all just an example of how, on a very small scale, I've also been using AI for language revitalization. And again, we'll talk just very briefly on, what are the limitations of that as well, but it is a way to start moving the needle. So as I mentioned, my folks are primarily Tudelose speakers, and I've been very active in the cultural and historical revitalization of my tribal nation, particularly when I was in college. And so there's, a lot of different, texts and sources that I've accumulated, especially on the Tulalosaponi language. In particular, this one really interesting document that is called a grammar sketch of Tulalosaponi. And I remember finding it and being like, wow, this has got some really awesome information in it. I can't wait to sink my teeth into it. And I tried. And then I remembered that I was never good at grammar in any language. And just trying to decipher the logic of that thing written down on words, and I don't have anyone to ask, questions to. So that's when I realized that AI could be really helpful in helping me to actually understand what this document was even trying to instruct me to do. So what I did was I went ahead and I got early access to Google Gemini 1.5, and I uploaded, some of these source documents that contain the, basics of Tulalosaponi and how it's grammatically organized. And what that's enabled me to do is get, little translations for things, or even to go as big as to ask it to make a language lesson for me. So just to give an example, you know, I could ask it, how would I say all my relations in Tulalosaponi? Oh, we're thinking hard today. Let's see. Let's try that one more time. It's still early days, folks. Still early days. All right. I'm going to let this do its thing. And while it's doing its thing, again, really what I want to show you all here is that it's a great tool for really helping us deal with some of these really big questions or barriers that we face in our community. So you can see now, after giving it a chance to think here, it's coming up with a few different suggestions. And so I think right here, number 2 is a great example for both the possibilities and pitfalls of AI. So I've already run through this a little bit, and so really the way that I've come up with, that's my preferred way of saying all my relations in my language, is number 2 here. However, knowing a little bit about the language myself, though, this word hook is actually supposed to come at the end, right? So it's actually supposed to be we masai hook, not hook we masai. And so that's an example of where AI is, on one hand, offering quite useful information, but it's not completely useful without that human review and check. And so that's where I would definitely encourage, if this is something that you find interesting, definitely partner with an elder or someone else who has experience in the language before you just go and get things from AI. So again, it's a good tool, it's helpful, but it is not without its mistakes, and we really need to remember that. And we really need to remember that this is just, again, it's a tool for us, and that just like any tool, tools can make mistakes. So it's really on us to still make sure that whatever we're sharing or saying is truthful and valid and accurate. But this is truly one other application of AI in an Indigenous context that I'm very excited about. And that, again, I think could have a lot of impact. And there are some drawbacks to this, right? Because as we've talked about a few times now, these models are trained on data sets that are, again, filtered from the perspective of predominantly white male English speakers. And this is an English speaking piece of AI. So there's definitely limitations to trying to get something that is fundamentally, based on the perspective of English to, do Indigenous language revitalization. But the possibility does exist there for for some movement and growth and impact. And this will definitely continue to improve as the technology itself matures. But so yeah, so having said that, we're going to just transition out of this demo again and just transition back to the slide. And so just to kind of start, bringing everything together here that we've talked about, just want to talk about some of the other, community-based initiatives and efforts that are going on around AI. So like we were just talking about the topic of language revitalization and AI, but also some of the limitations that exist by using some of these, models that are already out there. And so I have a friend, his name is Michael Running Wolf, and he's been very active for quite some time on really, discussing the intersections between indigeneity and AI. And so Michael Running Wolf has a project that's called the Waukeshan AI Language Consortium, and it's focused on creating an AI model that works with polysynthetic languages. So that's another way of saying it, an AI model that is very much so focused on working with indigenous languages, and something that I would think really escape some of those pitfalls that we were talking about some of these other systems that are really just encoded with the dominant dominant perspective. So that's some really great work that's going on. I would really, if anyone is interested in this, I would definitely encourage them to check out some of the work that Michael Running Wolf is doing. We talked a little bit about how, this could be used for language revitalization, again, on perhaps a larger scale, like something that Michael's doing, but also on a smaller scale. And then also, again, potential impacts for, different projects within MMIP. So there's been calls for a red feather alert system, really, nationwide. So really getting comprehensive coverage of what's going on with regards to the MMIP crisis. And again, we've also talked today about some of the ways that AI can be used to generate new data regarding the MMIP crisis as well. And then there's also another project that I am a co-founder on alongside Button, that's called Shock Talk. And Shock Talk uses AI in two ways. It uses AI as a chatbot to connect folks to culturally tailored support. And then we're also exploring how we can leverage AI to create a culturally tailored matching algorithm as well. So really a lot of possibilities exist out there for us to really go ahead and leverage AI in a way that serves our communities, serves our interests, and solves the problems that our communities are facing. And so so just so like I mentioned, so those are just some projects that are already out there. And then again, just to kind of summarize the main pieces of what we've talked about today, that LLMs are large language models. They're tools that are trained on existing data. And that, again, is largely filtered through the perspective of English-speaking white men. And so that, when we use LLMs to amplify the current system and current sets of relations, that will continue to increase inequality and adverse outcomes. Because that's what those systems are set up to do. But we can also take these LLMs and use them to solve the problems that our communities are facing, and to repair some of the broken relationships that we see in our communities, just in terms of our relationship to data, and being able to actually get that full picture of what's going on there. And so with that, I'm really excited about what we've shared today, and I know that we've still got some time here. So I would love to just go ahead and open things up for some Q&A, for some questions. So, if folks have any questions, you're definitely welcome to, come off mute, grab the mic, and ask away. And we'll also be checking the chat for questions as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave the mic open for any questions that might have popped up.
I've got a question if it's all right.
Sure, Hayden, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm Hayden. I'm a NYU graduate, First Nations from Australia. I only moved back to Melbourne like 3 days ago, so I'm listening from Melbourne morning. I really want to like acknowledge the work that you're doing. I'm trying to do similar work in the realm of like sound technology, and like indigenizing / decolonizing sound technology. And one of the topics that I think is really important to consider is Indigenous data sovereignty. And I was wondering like what your what your thoughts are around like protecting the data that you collect and kind of just like not allowing it to enter back into that system of extraction that AI typically kind of engages in. Yeah, I was just like curious about that because yeah, it is so heavily, particularly with language as well. It is so heavily, I guess, vulnerable in this space. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Um, and I think it's really relevant too because I don't know if it was today or yesterday, but definitely within the past 48 hours, there's a headline about an AI company using an actress's voice after the actress specifically said no. Um, so I think it's a complicated question in that I would ultimately say it's a matter of data sovereignty, right? But at the same time, um, the sovereignty does require somewhat of a reciprocal relationship in that someone has to actually acknowledge and respect that the sovereignty is there and not just trample all over it. So I think part of it comes down to the fact that there's probably certain legal protections that do need to be passed that are not in place because it does come down to an issue of data sovereignty, but how do you actually enforce that when people are just doing whatever they want? So I think that's an important question. And I think a lot of people are acknowledging in different ways that we need some more protections in place because right now, the way that these systems are going is they're scraping any and everything they can get their hands on. So yeah, I think it just really comes down to the fact that you have to protect your data as best you can. Keep whatever should be private, keep it private without hoarding data. But I think that there's work to do in actually fortifying those protections.
Yeah, thank you. I had a response to that, but it's so quickly left my brain. Oh yeah, so do you see in that case that there may be an instance of, you're saying that these frameworks are modeled off, white, Western, male, I guess, ontologies and whatnot. Do you see there ever being, do you think that there could ever be like an AI model that is built off like indigenous ontological systems or language systems that could exist and that kind of be this sort of decolonial version of artificial intelligence?
I do think it's possible, and I think like the work that Michael Runningwolf is doing is a great example of that. So I think it's possible, but that does also require um, some people putting the resources there so that way people can do that work. But I definitely think it's possible. It's just a matter of actually like giving people the resources and time and space to make that happen.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. And George, I see you've got your hand raised here.
Yes, how are you? I'm George Bodingking. Um, I I'm very familiar with AI, and I do quite a bit of work in AI myself. And I think that and this may not be a question for this. We could take it offline if we have to. But I don't understand the impact that this will have because I don't understand the system that the policies are under. I'm kind of new to really exploring I guess, the system of how our nations are coming together now. So I don't have a full understanding of how this is going to impact that work, if that makes sense. So I kind of will try to reach out, I guess, for some resources where I could research the system that you're working off of, like the policies. Where do the policies come from? Who passes them? Who's recognizing them? Are there nations that don't recognize them? I don't understand that whole system. So I'm very new to this. So I just thought I'd throw that out there in case anybody else is feeling the same way. But I look forward to like further engaging and finding out how I could learn that part of the equation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, George, for that question. And you know, if it's a question that you had, it's probably a question that at least like 3 other people in the room had. So thank you for, speaking up and bringing that forward. And so and I just also I want to just kind of restate just to make sure I'm understanding your question. It sounded like your question was just a little bit more about understanding, when I'm talking about like the dominant system and what that looks like. Is that what the question was around, or were you asking more like logistically, like, what's the database that these policies are coming from?
Yeah, it's all of that. And understanding like what the impact, like what would be a real case scenario of us taking a policy and breaking it down and understanding where it came from, who, like the whole system. I get the AI piece of it. I just don't get the system that you're trying to impact.
Absolutely, yeah.
Again,
Yeah, so I
I
think
I may not be using the right language. Again, I'm very, very new to this space of having conversations about uh indigenous information and how it's processed. So it does require some research on my part. I guess I need a starting point.
sure, yeah. Well, I can touch on that a little bit, and it sounds like we could probably also have a great like one-to-one. So after we kind of wrap up with Q&A, you and I can either talk more, or we can find some more time. But I'm more than happy to, just talk with you and, yeah, share some and see how I can help support. Um, and then, in terms of just your question though about, the actual impact, this has a really large impact for MMIP activists. So that way, again, activists who are on the ground actually know what's active in the state legislatures, what they're doing, what they're not doing, who thinks they're exempt from the problem. I can give you an example of that where, like, I grew up in Connecticut. I am still waiting for Connecticut to even put up one policy about MMIP. Because they just think that the problem doesn't apply to them, which is insane. But that's an important piece of information for activists on the ground to know. And then also family members and survivors, right? Like people who have deeply personal ties to this because they have experienced it themselves, or their very close loved one has experienced it. So these people want to know, what are you doing about it? We want to see that really clearly. So that's also part of what it really helps to impact. And then again, we also have a task force. And the task force is there to demand data and correct data collection processes. And so again, we can't necessarily make those demands if we don't know what's already going on and what that looks like. So on a very granular level, that's what it impacts. And then I would just say at a higher level, I mean, these are also data points that, again, are not being tracked by other folks. So it also is really important when we're, talking with folks who are in the state legislature as well, to say like, hey, because these are some things that we're noticing that you're not doing. So that's an overview, I'd say, of how like specifically the MMIP example is impactful. And I think that there's some more that we can talk about the broader systems, which we can talk more about that in a one-to-one or afterwards. But I hope that's helpful. Does that answer your question at all?
Kind of, sort of, but thank you. I appreciate the effort.
Okay, awesome. We'll talk more. We'll talk more. All right, Valerie, I see a question.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. I have been talking to, I don't know if you know Kyla, but she's the one who invited me. And Yeah, she was like, we were having a
Engaging with her.
conversation about AI, and she was like, I think this would be perfect for you. So my work is mostly around prison abolition, and I'm based in Philly, and I've been having conversations, so I'm really not in the AI world, but obviously, I'm paying attention to everything. And I've been having a lot of conversations with an elder who is currently incarcerated and sentenced to die in prison. And his focus, he's always been focused on technology. And so we were having a conversation around how our movement needs to utilize AI, utilize the beneficial possibilities of AI. And so we were talking about the idea of developing a system of AI analysis that could uproot the racism and sexism, classism, discrimination in the current system that decides who gets to come home from prison and who doesn't, in a way that could liberate more people from prison. Because currently it's like we have these parole boards, commutation boards that are made up of mostly old white men who are not from our communities, don't know our people, and really just have a self-interest in wanting them to stay in prison. But this idea to me is like very intimidating, and I'm looking at like risk assessment tools that currently exist that reproduce the social structures, like you were saying, a lot of AI does. So I'm just curious, like what you think about this idea, and if you know of any sort of work that's being done around this, or people who might want to partner in work like this.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I think just to answer very directly your question about do I know of anyone who's doing, work that sounds like what you just described to me? I don't. That does not necessarily mean that it's not going on, but I'm just personally not aware of it. To your question about like actually creating that system, again, I'm not sure what does or doesn't exist out there right now. But I think what's interesting is you may already actually have some like raw tools to get like a very early version of it going, which is basically, the first thing is centering the folks who have lived that experience, so that way we're using their worldview and not, some white male worldview of whoever's programming this, having them make the logic. And so having actually like writing out on paper, like what would that decision making process look like? And then their chat GPT, like just the regular version, or I think you might have to get the plus version, that's like $20 a month. You can make these things called custom GPT modules, where then you can feed in the logic that you co-created with the folks that you're working with. You can feed that in, and then you can ask it questions again based off of that logic, and it should reflect the logic structure that you've created. So I could see a pathway where you could at least get started on that and maybe have like a super early version of that going. And then just in terms of I guess more so along the lines of people who are doing this work, I would say definitely, look closely into both social impact work, and then I always lift up MIT Solve, which I've been a part of, and they have, different challenges and cohorts. I think actually today was their main keynote event, but I would definitely look in to see what some folks are doing around there, and just what the network and relationships look like around MIT Solve, and doing some of the work that you mentioned. But that's what I would say probably comes to my mind right now based off your question.
Thank you so much.
Of course. And then I want to just acknowledge, it looked like Harmony asked a question in the chat. So I see a question about do you know of any other ethical Indigenous related knowledge data set or balanced data sets? So on that question, Harmony, if you're able at all to contribute through the chat or to come off mute, by data sets, were you just talking about like the example of like the MMIP data set that we were working on, or did you or were you asking more generally about like AI models that are trained on Indigenous data? Harmony, are you with us? Well, I do not see Harmony, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer the question as best as I can, which is, yeah, just in terms of other balanced data sets. Again, there's probably at least one or two other out there. I can't name them for you off the top of my head, but there probably are at least there's probably at least a few other folks who are doing who are at least trying to create balanced data sets. I don't know of anyone who's doing that with Indigenous data sets and AI, but at least in terms of trying to create some more balanced data sets, I'm sure that there are at least some folks in the Indian country trying to do that work. So yeah, do folks have any other questions that come to mind? I know we've talked through a lot of things so far today, but happy to answer any other questions that might be on folks' brain. Amazing. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm just gonna go ahead and start wrapping things up here. So I just want to give a big aloha to everyone for joining and for showing up with your questions. Really appreciate your time joining us here and just being a part of this dialogue together. And so I'm just gonna go ahead and transition things over to my colleague Trini just to take us home, and George as well. I'll send you a message and we'll whether it's after this or whatever, we'll find a bit more time to chat. But with that said, Trini, why don't you go ahead and take us home?
Well, first of all, thank you for being our guiding light through this. I think it's so important to learn colonial systems and their working so we aren't conscripted in them, and how we can utilize this tool to resist erasure. Just like they can make evil extractive systems, we can make ones based in community, reciprocity, and liberation, as we've done for time immemorial. So thank you so much, Austin. That was amazing. I wanted to briefly talk about our last and final event for our summit, which is called Indigenous Sisterhood. And it's on Thursday, May 30th at 6 p.m. This event is dedicated to women, girls, and to spirit relatives, and will foster a gathering ground to pay tribute to MMIP, open the doors for transformative healing through sisterhood and community love, and with an open mic, artists and poets and storytellers honoring our collective sanctuary and healing for survivors and their families. And this Saturday, we're having our MMIP film screening with We Ride for Her, with some amazing, incredible female motorcyclists who are bringing attention to this crisis. So if you guys have any questions in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out. But with that, Kana family, and farewell till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.